So, hi, Michael. How's it going?
Good, thank you. How are
Good.
you?
I'm fine. For people listening or watching or however this is going out, I thought that Michael and I could get together and just have a little chat about what's going on in Stanley Park, how we got to this point, you know, why we got to this point, and maybe what we can do to save, hopefully, enough trees in Stanley Park to keep it as a forest. So, Michael, I wanted to start this by talking about the interview that Elisa Thibault from Global did with Bruce Blackwell in Stanley Park in those like really giant, ridiculous red hard hats. Um, why don't you tell me? Because when I spoke to you after we watched that interview, you said that interview showed evidence of a pretty substantial change in tone from Bruce Blackwell and hopefully from the city of Vancouver. So why don't you describe what was going on in that interview, and then tell me, what you meant by that.
I noticed two things of importance in the interview. The first one, as you suggested, was Bruce Blackwell revealed sort of an evolution in his assertions since the beginning of the logging project over a year ago to where we are now. So it used to be big fire danger, big danger of trees falling over and hurting people. Now it's evolved to no mention of fire danger that I recall in that interview, no mention of trees falling over and hurting people, but rather just the tops of trees that have been defoliated will come down in windstorms and land on people who are in the park, despite the fact that the park is closed. So that's where we are now. So Blackwell's claim is that we have to remove defoliated trees because in big windstorms, when the park is closed and people ignore the closure and come and stand below defoliated hemlocks, the tops of the hemlocks might blow off and hurt them. That's the claim now.
Right.
That's the first way that it's changed. Yeah.
Wow. That's a huge change because in the Blackwell report, what did Blackwell assess the fire danger to be in Stanley Park in the Blackwell report?
He said it was high now and it's only going to get higher as dead hemlocks fall. They're going to find fuels on the ground. So over the coming years, as the dead hemlocks fall, the fire danger is only going to get greater. He didn't make any mention of fire danger that I recall on his most recent video. It's all about like tops of trees falling off onto people standing below the trees.
Right. And one might wonder why we wouldn't just take the tops off the trees then, why we need to spend. What's this project going to cost us, do you think, all total?
Well, now they're saying that in total it's going to be 18.9 million. That's the figure. That's the last figure I heard. Yeah, yeah.
Right. Do you know how many times the park has been closed lately in the last little while?
I don't know for sure, but I know it's been closed several times. I think it was closed yesterday during the
Right.
storm. There's been a few closures during
Right.
windstorms. Yeah.
So they do close the park to protect people
They
from
do.
falling trees.
They do. Yeah, but Blackwell says, well, that's not good enough because people are going to ignore the closure and they're going to go stand under the dead hemlocks and the little tops are going to blow off and hit them. So therefore, we have to spend $18.9 million and cut them down because of the people that ignore the closures and go stand under hemlocks in big windstorms.
Well, for everybody listening, it's not a good idea to go and stand under any dead hemlocks in the middle of
when
a
the
windstorm.
park is closed. Yeah,
When the
and
park
if you
is
do,
closed.
and if you do, really, it's on you for being
Well,
stupid.
do you think that a corollary of that is it's okay to stand under live trees in a windstorm, like trees that are extremely foliated?
Well, that's the implication, right? That's the another irrational, counterfactual, illogical aspect to this whole logging project is it's targeting defoliated hemlocks, which all of the science shows are actually less hazardous than the
Right.
foliated.
Why don't you tell us a couple of bits of the evidence of why dead hemlock snags are actually less dangerous than the foliated live trees. Why don't you tell us about the evidence?
Because they don't have the foliage, and the foliage acts as a wind sail. So on living trees, the the green foliage, the needles, the leaves, if they're deciduous trees, they catch the wind. And that's why in windstorms, what you see, 90% of the trees that come down are foliated trees, not dead hemlocks. So it makes no sense that if the park board and the city of Vancouver wanted to eliminate all risk, they should be cutting down all the living trees, not the dead trees.
Well, let's not give them any ideas.
Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah.
And you've been in the park taking pictures of what's been going on, because we have had a few windstorms. I don't remember ever having this many windstorms in this rapid succession. So it's very concerning. And what have you found?
Photographs that I've taken and other people in our group have taken all reveal that the vast, vast majority of trees, before I said 90%, I think that's about roughly what it is, of the trees that have fallen across roads and paths in the last 2 months during the windstorms of this winter season, fall and winter season, have been living trees, not dead hemlocks. They've been largely cedar trees, also some spruce, some living hemlocks, very, very few cases of dead hemlocks. There have been a few partially defoliated hemlocks that came down, but it's really not very many. We have numerous numerous pictures of big, bushy, green, oftentimes young cedars that and maple trees that have come down across trails and roads. Those are dangerous in a windstorm. Yeah. Right.
So there's the idea that we're going to be all killed by these dead hemlocks if we don't remove them, ASAP is doesn't have any basis in any evidence that you found.
No. What happens is the dead hemlocks over a period of years will eventually deteriorate and decompose, and they do that in place or in situ. So there's various things that can happen. So in a big windstorm, pieces will fall off the tree, sort of land below the tree or near the tree. If there's not a windstorm, the dead trees gradually decompose. And you wind up with like a pile of very wet, spongy remains of the tree right there where the tree stood for the last, 10, 15 years. So there's this, what you do not see are dead hemlock snags come crashing down sideways. They don't do that usually. Every so often, if a dead tree has root rot and the root's unstable, then it might get uprooted in a big windstorm and the whole thing might come down. But that's also true for any living trees. There's nothing special about snags. So in general, snags are less dangerous, less likely to hurt people than living trees.
Well, I emailed Tina Fernandez at the City of Vancouver. She's the project manager for the Hemlock Looper and Wildfire Mitigation Plan. And I asked her to see all of the data that we'll talk about track in a second, but I asked her for the track data, the assessment data that suggested that all these trees needed to come down because it's not what our experts have suggested needed to happen. So she told me to email Stanley Park Forest at vancouver.ca. And then Stanley Park Forest, I don't know who's on that team, emailed back to say, any more information, you have to file a Freedom of Information request, which I did. And the response that I got back was that the City of Vancouver does not require the data for the trees, the assessment of the trees that are going to be coming down in Stanley Park. So this is pretty scandalous. Can you clear up what this means, that the city doesn't have the assessment data?
Right. So the city claims to be employing a system called TRAC, Tree Risk Assessment Qualification. It's one of two systems that are normally used in British Columbia to risk assess trees. The other one is called the WHTAC, which is the Wildlife Hazard Tree Assessor's Course. So the first problem here is that the Wildlife Hazard Tree Assessor's Course, WHTAC, would be the appropriate system to use in a park, recreation area, or municipal park with native trees. Stanley Park is a municipal park with native trees. So according to the province of British Columbia, the system that should be using to determine whether trees are a risk is the WHTAC. So that's the first problem, is that the City of Vancouver has not use WHTAC. They're using TRAC. TRAC is a system which is a derivative of the WHTAC. TRAC was developed for a very explicit purpose, which was to assess trees in residential areas, like on residential streets or in homeowners' backyards. It was meant as a more efficient way to assess urban trees in residential areas because TRAC leaves out certain considerations that aren't relevant to a tree in someone's backyard. For example, wildlife value, recreational value, worker safety is another consideration that's left out of TRAC, and cultural value. So those particular values and worker safety are not normally considered to be important in someone's backyard, although you could argue with that too, right? But anyway, so that's the purpose of TRAC. So when arborists are addressing trees in residential parts of the city and people's backyards, they'll make a TRAC assessment, and then they'll go to the city and seek a permit. If their assessment determines that the tree is a risk, they'll get a permit from the city to cut down the tree using a TRAC assessment. But that is a written record for each tree. So let's now accept that for the moment that the city of Vancouver is using the wrong system. They're using TRAC. They're not even using the wrong system correctly because TRAC requires a written documentation for each tree that's assessed. There's no such thing as just saying we're going to cut down 30,000 trees or whatever trees are defoliated because they're defoliated without actually assessing, inspecting the trees and making a written report, a written record of each tree and why it's hazardous. So what's really happening here is there are no records, there are no inspections, and they're cutting down trees that aren't hazardous. Because if they were actually going to go and inspect the trees they're cutting down, they would see that most of them are not hazardous.
So when we were in the park board meeting, Joe McLeod, a city staffer, Joe McLeod, said, you can do a level 1 assessment, or you can do a level 2 assessment, or you can do a level 3 assessment. We did a level 1 visual assessment and determined which trees had to come down. That's problematic. Why don't you explain why it's problematic, what Joe McLeod presented?
He doesn't understand TRAC. TRAC is not a choice between a level 1 or a level 2 or a level 3. That's completely the wrong way to think about it. It's not like there are 3 different levels and you can choose one of them and that's the one you're going to use to determine whether the trees are hazardous. That's not how it works. It's a hierarchical system. You start with a level 1, and that's a filtering process where you identify trees using a drive-through or a walk-through. From a distance, you identify which trees are potential hazards. And that's all it does. It doesn't determine which trees are hazards, they're potential hazards. The actual hazards will be only a subset of that. And there's no way to know whether a tree is an actual hazard until you do a level 2 basic assessment. So after you've done your level 1, you've now flagged trees that are possible hazards. But that doesn't mean they are hazards. You'd have to go up to the tree and you inspect the tree in a level 2 basic. Usually you use a mallet or you do a visual inspection. Merely being dead is not a hazard.
Right.
It would have to have root rot, or it would have to have like a top that was like splitting and about to come down or something. Then you could legitimately say that tree was an actual hazard, but you can't tell from a level 1 usually. Now, I don't want to make absolutes here. I mean, if on a level 1, you saw a tree that was leaning 45 degrees over a road and it was obviously rotted out, then you might be able to assess that tree as a hazard from a level 1, but that's very rare. So TRAC requires, and WHTAC require, a written documentation of each tree. And then what's supposed to happen is the person who does the assessment is supposed to bring the written record to the park manager. The park manager then approves or doesn't approve of the tree being mitigated and chooses what type of mitigation. As you alluded to before, the mitigation might just be taking the top off. If the top's about to come,
who's the park manager? Who's the park manager?
Well,
do we know?
I'm not sure exactly. There's a city staff that's running the park. there's Joe McLeod, or there's Amit Ganda.
The people who don't have any data.
I don't know who the manager is. I would, it's probably. I mean, I think the person that's been really the interface between the park and the contractor Blackwell has been Joe McLeod. So I would say he's probably the park manager. So so that's the way it's supposed to work, right? So, but that's not what's happening. What's happening is it's completely an arbitrary runaway system with no system. They're not using a system.
Yeah.
It's arbitrary. And what's happening is either Blackwell or the logging subcontractors, and I don't know who. It's very secretive, right? Maybe it's a supervisor. Maybe
Right.
it's
Well,
maybe
it's the Stanley Park Forest. Maybe we can't get any names. I asked if I could have the names of the people on this team so that I could address my emails. And Tina Fernandez said, "Oh, you just send it to that email address. And don't worry, it'll get there."
Right.
It's almost like the city is completely hiding whose responsibility this is.
Right, because the underlying problem is they're not using a system.
Right.
There's no structure. They're simply
Yeah.
chopping down trees.
Yeah. Now I'd like to get to another problem that we're seeing is, and this is what a number of the experts that came down and up to tour the park, Dominic De La Sala, chief scientist at Wild Nature, Len Vanderstar from SAFT, toured the park. And they said similar things, that the tree canopy is being opened up, wind tunnels are being opened up, and the tree roots are being damaged by this industrial equipment. Can you tell us about the tree that came down? Was it in May of 2024 on the causeway? What do you know about that tree?
The surrounding area had been previously logged in the previous couple months.
Right.
So there was a big opening in the canopy there. And several of our experts said in all probability, it's reasonable to conclude that there was increased wind
right.
in that area because the canopy had been opened just to the west of the tree that fell, and the winds were coming from the west on that day.
Right.
They were almost 50-kilometer-an-hour winds coming from the west. The tree was blown from the west to the east, so it fell in an eastward direction. So obviously the wind was coming from the west. It blew it east onto the causeway. The tree was inspected since then by a couple of our arborists, and the tree had root rot, so it was rotten,
Right.
and that's why it blew over. When the neighboring trees were removed, the defoliated hemlocks, the irony is that those defoliated hemlocks that were removed were probably not hazardous. The spruce was hazardous, but they didn't remove that one.
Right.
So the assessors failed to identify the tree that was actually a hazard. They left it there. They made things
Right.
worse by cutting down trees that were not hazards near it, opening up a wind tunnel. It's a cruel irony, right? So the tree they didn't cut down, the hazard, that tree fell down.
Right. Well, and it would be great if we could look back at the data to see what criteria they used to identify the trees, but the data just doesn't exist.
No,
So
but they've
we're in a
said
pickle.
they've told us no. There is no data because they're not inspecting trees to determine whether they're hazardous. What they've told us is that they're cutting down trees merely because they're defoliated.
Right.
That's the criteria. Now they've also suggested that they've evolved a little bit, and now they're not cutting down all trees, all 160,000 trees that are defoliated. They're only cutting down the ones that are defoliated and within striking distance of a path or a road, 1.5 tree lengths of a path or a road, and
Right.
they're leaving the other ones alone. That's what they say, but I don't believe them. They don't have a quota of numbers, right? They're just
Right.
cutting down trees. They'll tell us later what they'll claim they cut down X number of trees later, but it's
Right.
not in the contract. The scope of work that the city of Vancouver has with Blackwell does not specify a number of trees, which is another
Massive problem.
point. There's no Blackwell and his subcontractors are just doing what they want to do.
Right.
There's no system.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
there's another thing that came out recently. There's another little tidbit that came out recently. At the last park board meeting, Tina Fernandez said that they had consulted with 3 other companies, and although they hadn't had time to read the reports yet, seemed to suggest that these 3 reports all supported the Blackwell plan. Can you tell us what you found out about that from reading those reports?
Right. Well, at the meeting on December 9th, when the 3 commissioners voted
Right.
to pass the resolution, which accelerated the login and extended it for another 2 years at least.
Right. Three
Three-
voted
three-
yes, 2 voted to abstain, and 2 left early. So didn't
2 left
vote
early.
at all.
So that whole thing was carried by three votes, right?
Yeah.
So in all fairness, I reviewed the transcript and the video of the meeting. Tina Fernandez was actually fairly honest in her statement that there hadn't been enough time yet to evaluate the reports. So in the 2 weeks prior to the meeting, the city of Vancouver scrambled to find 3 companies which Tina Fernandez did claim were independent companies, which is actually not true.
Right.
To do a very quick, like several hour walkthrough assessment of certain areas in the park that the city wanted to accelerate the logging in. So those 3 companies did their quick walkthroughs. They issued reports, and the reports were very short. Like each one was like a couple pages, and they were given to the commissioners before the vote on December 9th. When the commissioners asked Tina Fernandez about the report, she said, well, I haven't. They said, do these 3 assessments, do they support the resolution? Do they support accelerated the logging or not? And Tina Fernandez actually quite honestly said, I don't know, because we haven't had time to evaluate them yet.
So why
here
would
they are.
Bringing this?
Here they are about to vote on a resolution, and the critical piece of evidence they needed was whether these 3 quote unquote independent assessors agreed with the acceleration of the logging, and there hadn't been time to evaluate it yet. But Tom Digby, who apparently is quite interested in getting the logging going faster and faster, waved the reports in his hand, and he said, well, I've read them, and all 3 of them, they support the acceleration of the logging.
Well, do they? Because you've read them.
Then 2 of the commissioners walked out of the room. 3 promptly voted to approve the resolution, even though there hadn't been enough time to evaluate the critical reports yet. And then 2, including Tom Digby, abstained. So we have had experts evaluate the reports. For the most part, they do not agree with the city's position of accelerating the logging.
Or even logging as many as they want to log in the first place.
No, they don't. And there's one of them that sort of agrees with the city, but not completely, because there's one report from a company called Chartwell, which says that dead hemlock should be removed, but it doesn't say that the timeline should be accelerated.
Right.
So it really doesn't support the resolution. And the other problem with that Chartwell report is that Chartwell is not independent, because Chartwell is a subcontractor of Blackwell.
So they're already doing work in the park.
So Chartwell and Chartwell specifically, his role as subcontractor was to do a visual assessment at the beginning of the project. So the original Blackwell report, the one that recommended logging out the dead hemlocks, Blackwell hired Chartwell to help with the visual assessment, which helped them determine that they should chop down all the dead hemlocks.
So did he get paid for a second walkthrough? Yeah.
So now the city of Vancouver pays Chartwell to come in again and to give its opinion of whether there should be acceleration of the logging. And Chartwell said, I didn't even say there should be acceleration. Chartwell just regurgitated what the Blackwell report said a year ago, January 24, which was cut down the dead hemlocks.
I wonder how much he got paid for that second report.
More taxpayer money, right?
Yeah. So, okay, then talk about the other 2, the other 2 independent companies.
So one of them was from Davy Resource Group. Davy Resource Group divided the part of the park that they were asked to assess, I don't know if it was the whole park, part of the park, into 10 areas. So in 6 of the 10 areas, Davy said you should do individual tree inspections.
Wow.
And in a minority of the areas, Davy said, we support acceleration of the logging. But there's no reason to believe that Davy was informed of what the project was. So Davy didn't know that necessarily that the project they were saying should be accelerated involved cutting down trees that hadn't been inspected.
Right.
And because Davy, in fact, said in the 6 areas that it didn't say the logging should be accelerated. It said it said inspect the trees.
Right.
So it was a weak, very weak. David provided weak support. In fact, in the majority of the area that it assessed, it did not support the acceleration.
Right.
So the Diamond Head very, very clearly stated there needs to be inspections. Diamond Head did not say accelerate the logging. Diamond Head said you need to do inspections. Diamond Head also said you need to set risk threshold and you need to set occupancy rates. So Diamond Head and Davy both caught wind of the fact that there needs to be inspections done, and they weren't being done. And they actually said, and Diamond Head was the most explicit, you got to do inspections. This speaks to what WHTAC is very clear about, is that risk equals hazard times exposure. So exposure is sort of another way of saying occupancy. So if a trail or road has very, very low occupancy, even though a tree might be hazardous, the risk isn't going to be high.
Right.
If one person walks by every 2 hours, that's not a very high exposure. Here's the important point that we've learned from our experts. You don't mitigate hazard, you mitigate risk. And the only way to know risk is you have to know hazard and you have to know exposure. City of Vancouver has not done any of that stuff, and Diamond Head caught on to that, and they said you've got to determine the occupancy rate, the exposure, and you've got to determine the hazard in order to continue.
It's like kind of outrageous, right? Like when I'm talking to you about this, I think this can't possibly be what's going on in the city of Vancouver. Like you and I have learned this in the last year from reading the reports and meeting with experts and going through the park. I obviously don't understand it as in depth as you do, but we're talking about, this is basic stuff that trained arborists, and one would think park managers and people hired to assess a park and cut down potentially a third of the trees. This is basic stuff that they should be doing that is not being done.
Yeah, and the reason they're not doing it, Jillian, isn't just because they're negligent not doing it. It's because if they did it correctly, then there would be evidence that the trees shouldn't be cut down.
Right.
Because if they were actually inspecting trees that were defoliated or any other trees, and they were actually determining what the exposure was, they would find out that the risk is very low. Now, the other thing that they have to do is they have to set their risk tolerance level. So the park manager would have to decide what level of risk is acceptable.
Right.
And that has to be
the nameless Stanley Park Forest Group would have to get together.
Yeah, and the reason that has to be done is because once you've used your formula, risk equals hazard time exposure, now you've gotten your risk. That still doesn't tell you whether you should mitigate the tree.
Right.
Whether you should mitigate the tree depends on what your risk tolerance is.
Right.
And almost certainly, if the risk is low or very low, you would not mitigate the tree.
Right.
Really, the question is, do you accept a moderate risk or not?
Right.
So it would be legitimate, I suppose, for if the city of Vancouver was properly inspecting the trees and properly using either track or they should be using WHTAC, and they properly assessed with records, with documentation, and for good cause, assessed a single tree or multiple trees individually to be moderate risk, it would be legitimate for them to say, well, we've set our risk tolerance level at moderate, therefore those moderate and above need to be mitigated. That would be legitimate.
Right.
But they're not doing that. Right. Now, many park managers would set a higher risk threshold, say high. And the reason for that is because in WHTAC, you have to accept some risk in order to retain the wildlife value, the cultural value, and protect worker safety of trees. So,
and even the recreation value, right? Like
recreational value, right?
People want to go for a walk in the forest. They don't want to go through a walk in the blazing sun. Right. Otherwise, they'd stay on the seawall or sit in a park, right?
Stanley Park is highly valued. One of the main purposes, not the only purpose, one of the main purposes of Stanley Park is as a recreational area for hikers, for walkers, to bird watchers, cyclists, photographers, people who just want some solitude. They want to get away from the city. They want to come there. They have different ways of recreating. It's a
Right.
recreational area, and that has to be respected in determining the risk tolerance. So
Right.
a good argument could be made that even a moderate risk level should be accepted, and they should be cautious about closing the park, diligent about closing the park
Yeah.
during windstorms. They're not even correctly determining hazard. They've done nothing.
Right. Right.
They're incorrectly stating that defoliated hemlocks are hazardous. They haven't even inspected them to see if they're hazardous. If they were hazardous, they haven't determined what the exposure is. If they've determined hazard and exposure, they haven't determined what the risk threshold is that they're willing to accept. They've done nothing. They have no system. Right. The whole thing is willy-nilly. It's arbitrary. Right. It's illegitimate.
We take on a moderate risk every time we walk around the city or ride our, I cycle around the city, and we're certainly not, we're certainly not going through this like $18.9 million procedure to keep people safe on their bicycles or even walking across on a crosswalk. So,
well, because our experts have said, honestly, there's always some risk. There's never zero risk. If you want there to be zero risk, cut down all the trees.
Right.
And plant, make everything into a, but even that wouldn't eliminate all risk.
Well, then we'd increase the flooding risk.
Yeah. And then you have parking lots. Now now you have risk of hitting by a car, or you make everything grass, and now, it'll be a icy morning and people will slip on the grass. So, there's no way to eliminate all risk. And that is why the last step would be to establish a risk threshold.
Right. Right.
And if you haven't done that, you can't proceed with mitigation. So they haven't checked off any of the tick boxes required under either track or WHTAC, which have to be ticked off before they can legitimately and reasonably start mitigating trees. They're just going in there, not even having done the first step. Right. The first step is even determining whether the trees are hazardous.
And they're just being allowed to do it. It's like...
Yeah, they're getting away with it so far.
It's just like... well, hopefully not. We have filed and we are waiting on a lawsuit. I mean, that they're accelerating logging. Like, I don't know how many they're going to get, they're going to get down before this lawsuit is heard. But what's the state of this lawsuit?
Well, our lawyer's working on it. It's complicated. The whole thing is it's a cobweb, of complications. The underlying problem is that it's very hard to get the courts to intervene on decisions of a administrative body like the city of Vancouver or the park board. It's really, really hard. I mean, they'll do it in extreme cases, but it's hard to convince them to do it. And there's reasons for it, and they're not necessarily bad reasons. It's just the way there's a separation of powers, right? So the courts don't want to step in and substitute their opinions for that of the, elected administrative bodies.
Right.
Or the appointees of the elected representatives. So in a way, there's a democracy argument, right? So it would be undemocratic for a judge to substitute his or her judgment for the judgment of elected officials or the appointees of elected officials. Right. So that's the problem. It's like a legal theory problem. Right. So what we have to somehow show that first we have to identify a decision to challenge, and that's difficult because there's been so many decisions and so many non-decisions. A lot of this has happened without any decisions. So what decision do we identify?
That's the bureaucracy. That's the bureaucratic system, and that's what it's like everybody is sending you to another desk.
Yeah. So for the first year of the logging, there was no decision by the park board. The Joe McLeod and the staff, the city employees, just went ahead and with this whole logging operation without even getting a decision by the park board. Right. So there was nothing there to challenge. And I suppose we could, there would be some kind of claim against Joe McLeod for acting without authorization, and we tried that, but we couldn't get a judge to rule in our favor. So now that the park board has a year later made a decision,
just an absolutely bizarre decision because of the overwhelming preponderance of evidence is that we shouldn't be cutting down, that we should put a giant pause on this and get the trees properly assessed. Everybody's saying stop and get the trees properly assessed. So the park board decision to go ahead with this based on just 3 yeses is just, it's mind-boggling and absolutely outrageous that the citizens of this city are just allowing them to get away with it.
We will have to convince a judge that the decision was so unreasonable and so irrational that it should be quashed. And
right.
we're trying
Which
to,
it
we're
seems
trying to
like
do
it
that.
is. Yeah.
I think we might have a case here because this last vote, not only was it only three commissioners that voted yes, but they had no evidence. The evidence that was presented to them, even by the admission of the presenter of the evidence, Tina Fernandez, hadn't been evaluated yet.
Right.
So that when at the time they voted, the evidence hadn't been evaluated.
Right.
Now, the commissioners did have the papers in front of them, so I suppose they could have looked at them. And the only person who even showed any evidence of having read the reports was Tom Digby, who was waving it around, and his conclusion was completely wrong.
Right.
They did not
that
all
he might
three.
not have read it.
Yeah, or maybe he skimmed it or something. So there's
Right.
really no rational basis for them to have approved this.
Right. And do we
resolution.
have a timeline?
Well, I'm hoping that in the next few weeks we can get a new filing made.
Right.
Yeah, but
it just takes so long, and it's like this is what's going on with all of the forests in British Columbia. It's the talk and log, right? And it's just crushing me that we're in a talk and log situation in Vancouver, and people are hearing and seeing this happen, and are feeling really traumatized by it. Like, quite frankly, when I go in the park and I hear that chainsaws, I'm just like, and I know that they're cutting down these trees based on no data.
They're cutting down trees that are not hazardous trees.
Yeah.
The overwhelming majority of the trees they're cutting down are not hazardous trees. They're cutting them down for no good cause. Dead trees, they're brown. They must be fire hazard. They must be a danger of falling. And so we should cut them down. But if you look at the science, right? If you look at the science now, and we've discovered the science, there are many scientists right now.
And it didn't take very long at all. Like, it didn't take us very long to consult a few people and start getting the information and be like, okay, that's clearly.
Because there are scientists out there.
Right?
Yeah. There's a new generation of scientists. By new generation, I don't mean like 18-year-old kids. I mean many of them are pretty old, right? A lot of the ones we consulted, but they're by new generation. I mean in the last couple decades,
or maybe they're the really old generation.
Yeah. Well, the point is that there's an old narrative that's been developed and promoted by forestry companies, by logging companies who had a commercial interest in logging. And the narrative was that tree thinning reduces fire danger. It keeps forests healthier. We need to manage forests by thinning out dead trees and even living trees. The new science, and there's been a lot of research done, and we actually had affidavits from 3 experts who have done a lot of this research. One of them came all the way from Southern Oregon. He's done a lot of research that shows, this is evidence-based research, shows that thinning forests does not reduce fire hazard. It actually increases it. Yeah. So this old forestry narrative, unfortunately, is still prevailing at University of British Columbia. Yeah. And that is the flimsy evidence that the city of Vancouver relies upon. They say, well, the professors at UBC say that we're doing the right thing.
Right.
So, but it's old forestry industry narrative. It's not borne out in empirical data.
Yeah, and the best comment I've heard around that is from Rhonda Milliken, who'd studied this, who said that Jasper had endured 10 years of forest thinning before it burned. So if forest thinning worked, we would not have lost Jasper. Okay,
and even the UBC professor that City of Vancouver likes to cite, even if you listen to his actual statements, he even qualifies them. He said, "I don't know about the scope of this project."
Right.
So even their best witness has expressed some doubt about whether it's really legitimate what they're doing.
Okay.
The scope of what they're doing.
Yeah. Okay, well, let's hope we can save a few trees. So next up, I guess we can let people know we are going to be asking for members to join the Stanley Park Preservation Society. So that will be coming. How can people sign up to get information on how to do that, Michael?
I'm
What's
going
the
to put
best
it on
way?
the website shortly. It's going to take
Okay.
me a little bit more time to get up on the website, but people go
Okay.
to savestanleypark.ca,
Okay.
www.savestanleypark.ca. I'll have
Yeah.
a membership form on there.
Okay. And we'll also have, if there's anybody out there who hasn't signed our petition yet, you can sign our petition, and we do send out regular updates. So then you will get more information on how to move forward with this. And we're going to look to have some fundraisers coming up soon. Maybe a telethon that you can come to. We'll have some entertainment. Any entertainers out there, if you want to help us out by donating some of your time and talent, you can also get in touch. And we would be happy to meet you. And we're hoping to have lots more information sessions coming up in the new year. And get this madness stopped.